Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the scandals, the cover-ups, the firings, the walkouts, and the moments that shook corporate America till its core. This is every HR scandal that shocked corporate America. Explained. The Coldplay Incident. We're starting with the most recent scandal on this list, and arguably one of the most revealing, because this one wasn't just about a moment caught on camera. It's about what happens after and who's forced to carry the consequences. On July 16, 2025, at Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts, Coldplay was performing live. As frontman Chris Martin often does during his Jumbotron song, he asked the cameras to scan the crowd and find couples to put on the big screen. The camera landed on two people, a man with his arms wrapped around a woman. She leaned into him. They looked like they were smiling. They looked comfortable. They looked close. And then they looked up. They saw themselves on the screen and everything changed. Her jaw dropped. Her hands flew into her face. She turned away. He ducked behind a barrier. The crowd noticed. Chris Martin noticed. He looked at them and said, either they're having an affair or they're just shy. The crowd laughed. The internet did not. Within hours, the video was everywhere. TikTok, Twitter, Reddit, every major news outlet. Then people began to identify the couple. The man was Andy Byron, CEO of Astronomer, a New York-based tech company. The woman was Kristen Abbott, Astronomer's chief people officer. Both were married, both visibly panicked, and both were now the center of a viral moment that quickly escalated into a corporate crisis. Now, this is where the story becomes more than just internet drama. Yes, Kristen Cabot was the head of HR. Her role was to uphold company policy, enforce professional boundaries, and handle situations exactly like this, and she was involved in it. But she wasn't the only one. Andy Byron was the CEO, the highest-ranking leader in the company, responsible for setting the tone, the culture, and the standard. And in situations like this, power does matter, because this wasn't just two employees. This was a dynamic between the most powerful people in the company and the people responsible for holding everyone accountable. Astronomer went silent for more than 2 days, and in that silence, the internet filled in the gaps. Fake resignation letters, fake apology videos, fake press releases. By the time the company responded, the narrative had already taken over. When they finally did respond, they launched an investigation internally. Andy Byron resigned. Kristen Cabot resigned days later. Then, in one of the most surreal PR moves in recent memory, Astronomer brought on Gwyneth Paltrow as a temporary spokesperson to address the situation. Paltrow, the ex-wife of Chris Martin, that same Chris Martin whose concert started all of this, you genuinely cannot make that up. But here's the part that didn't go viral in the same way. Kristen Cabot later spoke out. She said that she had already been separated from her husband and that Byron told her he was separated as well. She described the aftermath, harassment, threats, her children fearing for their safety. And throughout all of it, Andy Byron said nothing. No public statement, no real-time accountability, no shared responsibility in a fallout. And that's where the real story is, because both individuals made decisions that didn't align with the company values, but only one became the face of consequences. From an HR perspective, yes, this is a breakdown in professional boundaries, but from a leadership perspective, this is about power, accountability, and silence, because when leaders don't step forward, someone else ends up carrying the weight. Enron's collapse. If the Coldplay scandal was about one person violating the rules, Enron is about the entire company building a culture where the rules didn't exist, or more accurately, where the rules existed on paper, in a booklet, on a mouse pad, in t-shirts, and key rings, and meant absolutely nothing in practice. Enron, if you don't know the name, you definitely heard the concept. The biggest corporate fraud in American history. But most people know the financial side of the story. Today, we're telling the HR side, because what happened at Enron was not just about accounting fraud. It was a complete and total failure of workplace culture, and HR was in the room the entire time. Let's start from the beginning. At its peak, Enron was celebrated for its innovation, rapid growth, and seemingly unstoppable momentum. It was considered one of the best places to work in America. Fortune magazine named it the most innovative company in the country 6 years in a row. The stock was rising, the bonuses were massive, and the culture was electric. But underneath that electricity was something darker. Enron had a 61-page code of ethics, a booklet centered on the company's guiding principles of RICE: respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Every single employee had to sign a certificate of compliance. And then, the code of ethics was suspended twice in 1 year to allow certain financial transactions involving a senior executive to proceed. They suspended their own ethics code twice in 1 year because it was inconvenient. That's the Enron story in 2 sentences. Now here's the HR layer that almost nobody talks about. Enron's HR department was responsible for framing and policing the company's corporate values, its recruitment policy, and the performance processes that shaped the culture. And the culture they built, or allowed to be built, was one of the most toxic in corporate history. Enron's performance management system, developed and maintained by HR, graded employees on a forced curve. Every year, the bottom 15% of performers were fired. They called it rank and yank. It sounds brutal because it was. It created an environment where employees were terrified of failure. where honesty was dangerous, where admitting a problem could end your career. So nobody admitted problems. They hid them. And the executives at the top, Ken Lay, Jeff Skilling, and CFO Andrew Fastow, used complex off-balance sheets partnerships to hide hundreds of millions of dollars of debt while selling over 1.1 billion of Enron stocks to themselves, all while publicly telling investors and employees to keep buying. Employees had their retirement savings, their 401ks, heavily invested in Enron stock. The executives knew the company was collapsing. The employees did not. And then there was Sharon Watkins. In midsummer 2001, Enron Vice President Sharon Watkins wrote an anonymous memo to Chairman Kenneth Lay, warning the improper accounting methods and arguing that the company's financial statements were grounded in systemic fraud. She wrote, "I am incredibly nervous that we will implode in a wave of accounting scandals." She took her concerns to the top, and nothing happened. All of Enron's whistleblowers behaved in an exemplary fashion. They did not steal documents or go to the newspapers. They took their concerns to the top, and nothing happened. That's the HR failure. Not just the accounting fraud, the fact that when employees tried to do the right thing, the system that was supposed to protect them did nothing. When Enron declared bankruptcy in December 2001, it took with it $74 billion in assets. 4,000 employees lost their jobs. Retirees lost their entire retirement portfolios. 22 people were ultimately convicted, including Enron's CEO, president, CFO, treasurer, and heads of business units. Skilling was convicted and served prison time. Fastow pled guilty and cooperated with investigators, and Lay died before sentencing, leaving many feeling justice was incomplete. Meanwhile, Lou Pai, a former Enron executive, was able to exit the company early, walking away with millions before the collapse and avoiding criminal charges altogether. Together, their stories highlight a critical truth. When leadership operates without accountability, the consequences rarely fall evenly, and it's often on employees and the public who pay the highest price. Uber's secret. What if one of the fastest growing companies in the world was quietly ignoring sexual harassment, retaliation, and a completely broken HR system? Because in 2017, that's exactly what happened at Uber. And it didn't come from the media. It came from one employee who decided to expose everything. Her name was Susan Fowler, a software engineer who joined Uber expecting a career opportunity but instead walked into one of the most toxic workplace cultures in Silicon Valley. On her first day, her very first day, her manager sent her inappropriate messages. She reported it to HR, and HR's response? They told her that the manager was a high performer and that it would be his quote-unquote first offense. So instead of investigating properly, they gave her two options: transfer teams or stay and deal with it. And that was just the beginning. Fowler later revealed that women were consistently denied promotions. Complaints were ignored or buried. HR protected top performers over employees. Retaliation was subtle, but very real. At one point, she even warned that continuing to report issues could hurt her career. So she did something most employees are afraid to do. She went public in a blog post titled, "Reflecting on One Very, Very Strange Year at Uber." She detailed everything, and it went viral. The backlash was immediate. Uber launched an internal investigation. Over 200 employees were investigated. More than 20 were fired. And the company's CEO at the time, Travis Kalanick, was forced to resign. This wasn't just a bad manager situation. This was a complete HR failure, because HR's role is supposed to be protect employees, enforce policy, create a safe workplace. But at Uber, HR became a shield for leadership instead. The scandal changed how companies approach workplace culture. It forced organizations to rethink how complaints are handled, how power dynamics affect HR decisions, and whether HR is truly there for employees or for the company. Because sometimes the biggest risk to a company isn't what happened publicly, it's what's being ignored internally. Fox News exposed. At one point, Fox News wasn't just dominating cable television, it was shaping national conversations. But behind the scenes, there was something else shaping the workplace: fear, silence, and power that went unchecked for years. And at the center of it all was one man, Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes wasn't just an executive, he was the architect of Fox News. He built the network into a media powerhouse, and with that success came influence. The kind of influence that made people hesitant to question him. Inside the company, there was long-standing allegations about his behavior, particularly towards women. Multiple employees later came forward describing a pattern: inappropriate comments, coercion, and in some cases, career advancement not tied to performance or work ethic, but instead tied to staying silent. But for years, these weren't public scandals. They were internal stories, circulated quietly, never formally addressed in a way that created real change. That's what made this an open secret. People knew, they just didn't feel safe enough or supported enough to do anything about it. The turning point came in 2016 when Gretchen Carlson filed a lawsuit against Ailes, alleging sexual harassment and retaliation after her contract was not renewed. This wasn't just a complaint, it was a public challenge to one of the most powerful figures in media. And once it was filed, others began to come forward. Among them was Megyn Kelly, who later confirmed that she too had experienced harassment. What had been whispered internally for years was now undeniable. From an HR perspective, this wasn't a sudden breakdown, it was a long-term failure, because systems don't just fail when a complaint is ignored, they fail when employees don't trust the system enough to even report it in the first place. When power becomes a deterrent to accountability, when protecting leadership becomes more important than protecting the people. So an internal investigation was launched, and within weeks, Roger Ailes resigned. Fox News ultimately paid a $20 million settlement to Gretchen Carlson, but by that point, the damage had already been done, not just to the individuals, but to the company's credibility and culture. The real lesson here isn't about one executive abusing power. It's about what happens when an organization allows that power to go unchecked for too long. HR isn't just responsible for handling complaints, it's responsible for creating an environment where those complaints can actually be made safely. And when that environment doesn't exist, silence becomes part of the culture. Because in cases like this, the biggest failure isn't what happened, it's about how long it was allowed to continue. Google Walkout. For years, Google was seen as the gold standard of workplace culture, innovation, perks, flexibility, and a reputation for being one of the best places to work. But in 2018, that image cracked, and it didn't come from a competitor or a regulator or even leadership. It came from the employees themselves. The breaking point was a report revealing that a senior executive, Andy Rubin, had been accused of sexual conduct, and instead of being terminated outright, he left the company with a reported $90 million exit package. For many employees, that wasn't just a bad decision, it was a betrayal, because it signaled something deeper, that accountability wasn't applied equally, especially at the top. What followed was something corporate America rarely sees at that scale. More than 20,000 Google employees across offices around the world participate in a coordinated walkout. They left their desks, stood outside their offices, and demanded change. Not quietly, not internally, but publicly. This wasn't just about one executive. It was about a pattern. Employees were calling out forced arbitration and harassment cases, lack of transparency in investigations, and a culture where leadership decisions didn't align with the company's stated values. From an HR perspective, this moment was a shift in power. Traditionally, HR controls the narrative, handling complaints internally, managing investigations, and protecting the organization from risk. But here, employees bypassed that entire structure. They organized, communicated, and forced the company into a public response. It showed that when its trust in internal systems breaks down, employees will create their own systems of accountability. And Google had to respond. The company ended forced arbitration for sexual harassment and assault claims, committed to more transparency in how cases were handled, and made changes to its own reporting processes. On paper, those are significant wins, but the fact that it took a global walkout to get there says everything about the gap between policy and practice. The real lesson here isn't just that employees spoke up, it's that they did it together, because one complaint can be dismissed, one voice can be ignored, but 2,000 or 20,000 employees walking out at the same time, that's not a complaint, that's a culture shift. HMV's Meltdown. In 2013, HMV found itself in the middle of a corporate crisis. The company was struggling financially, entering administration and preparing for mass layoffs. But what should have been a controlled internal HR process turned into one of the most public HR meltdowns in real time. During a round of layoffs at HMV's headquarters, members of the social media team were called into a meeting, one by one, to be terminated. What leadership didn't account for was this. The very employees being laid off were the ones who controlled the company's official Twitter account. So when the terminations were happening, one employee still had access, and instead of logging off quietly, they started tweeting. For HMV's official account, the employee began live posting the layoffs as they were unfolding. Tweets described confusion, poor communication, and the fact that employees responsible for the company's entire digital presence were being let go without a clear transition plan. At one point, they even encouraged followers to follow them for updates, essentially turning a corporate account into a live broadcast of internal dysfunction. And it went viral. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching a company lose control of its own narrative in real time. From an HR and operations perspective, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was a breakdown in basic offboarding protocol. There was no immediate access controls, no coordinated communication plan, and no structured transition of critical systems. In a moment where the company needed the control the most, it had none. Eventually, HMV regained access to the accounts and deleted the tweets, but by that time, the damage was already done. Screenshots had spread across the internet, and the story became a case study in how not to handle layoffs in the digital age. The real issue wasn't that an employee spoke out, it's that the company created an environment where that was even possible. Because HR isn't just about policies, it's about execution. And when execution fails, especially in high-risk moments like terminations, the consequences just don't stay internal. Sometimes they tread. The Wells Fargo Incident. For years, Wells Fargo was known for one thing: performance. The company pushed a simple but powerful idea: sell more products to every customer. Checking accounts, saving accounts, credit cards, loans. Internally, they called it cross-selling. Externally, it looked like growth. But behind that growth was pressure. Employees were given aggressive sales targets, numbers that had to be hit no matter what. Daily quotas, constant tracking, and a culture where falling short didn't just mean you're missing a bonus. It meant you can lose your job. So employees adapted. Thousands of them began opening accounts that customers never asked for. Credit cards were being issued without consent. PIN numbers were created and emails were faked to enroll customers in services that they didn't even know existed. All of it to meet expectations for many that felt impossible. Over time, this wasn't just a few bad decisions, it became a system. More than 3.5 million unauthorized accounts were eventually uncovered, and when the story broke in 2016, the fallout was immediate. The company faced billions in fines, public outrage, and congressional hearings. The CEO at the time, John Stumpf, ultimately stepped down. But here's where the layer of HR comes in. Because it wasn't just compliance failure, it was a culture failure driven by performance management. The incentive structures, the quotas, the constant pressure, those weren't accidents, they were designed, and when employees raised concerns internally, many reported being ignored, dismissed, or even terminated for not meeting unrealistic expectations. In some cases, employees who refused to participate in unethical behavior were the ones who lost their jobs. And that's what made this so dangerous, because the system didn't just allow misconduct, it punished integrity. From an HR perspective, this is what happens when performance is measured without boundaries, when metrics matter more than ethics, when leadership focuses so heavily on outcomes that they stop questioning how those outcomes are being achieved. Wells Fargo didn't just have employees making bad decisions, it had a culture that made those decisions feel necessary. And that's the difference between isolated misconduct and a systemic failure. FDIC's dark side. On the surface, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation exists to protect stability. It insures deposits, oversees banks, and steps in during financial crises. It's supposed to be one of the most trusted institutions in the financial system. But eternally, a very different story was unfolding. In recent years, reports began to surface describing a workplace culture inside the FDIC that was deeply troubling, particularly for women. Allegations included sexual harassment, misconduct by senior officials, and a pattern of behavior that employees said had been tolerated for years. But what made the situation especially concerning wasn't just the allegations themselves. It was how long they persisted without meaningful intervention. Employees described environments where inappropriate behavior was normalized, where reporting felt risky, and where leadership didn't consistently act in ways that built trust. In some cases, individuals who raised concerns felt sidelined or ignored, while those accused of misconduct remained in positions of authority. That's what turned this from isolated incidents into a systemic issue. Because when patterns repeat over time, across teams, across leadership levels, it points to something deeper than individual behavior. It points to culture. From an HR perspective, this is one of the most difficult failures to address because it's not about one moment, one complaint, or one investigation. It's about an environment where the system itself doesn't function the way it's supposed to, where policies may exist, but enforcement is inconsistent, where accountability depends on position and not behavior. And in organizations tied to public trust like this one, the impact is even greater. Because if an institution responsible for oversight and protection struggles with its own internal culture, it raises questions about effectively if it can uphold those standards externally. Investigations into the FDIC's workplace culture led to increased scrutiny, leadership changes, and calls for reform. But like many in cases of this video, the response came after years of reported issues, not before. The real takeaway here isn't just about misconduct, it's about what happens when systems designed to protect people stop working. SHRM's hypocrisy. If there's one name that defines HR in America, it's SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management. They certify professionals, set workplace standards, and position themselves as the authority on how companies should treat their people. So when the cracks started showing from the inside, it hit differently, especially in the HR community. Former employees began raising concerns about internal culture, transparency issues, leadership style, whether SHRM's own environment actually reflects the values they were putting out in teaching. Inclusivity, psychological safety, employee voice, the perception gap between what is being preached and what is being practiced started to show. And then December 2025 made it impossible to ignore. A federal jury in Colorado ordered SHRM to pay $11.5 million to a former employee, Rehab Mohammed, after finding the organization liable for racial discrimination and retaliation. Mohammed said a supervisor treated her less favorably than her white colleagues, excluding her from meetings and subjected her to stricter scrutiny. And that, after she complained internally, things got worse. Records show that SHRM began drafting her termination documents on the same day she filed a retaliation complaint. Here's where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. A serious discrimination complaint was assigned to someone without prior experience handling investigations. That decision matters. SHRM actually tried to prevent Muhammad from referencing the organization's status as an HR authority during trial, but the judge denied it, ruling that SHRM's self-proclaimed expertise was integral to the case. The jury agreed. The award included $1.5 million in compensatory damages and $10 million in punitive damages. So here's the real takeaway, and it applies to every organization, not just this one. Having the knowledge of what good HR looks like is not the same as practicing it. Culture isn't defined by what you teach. It's defined by what your employees experience every day. And when the organization built to hold everyone else accountable becomes the case study, it raises the most uncomfortable question in the field. How are employees expected to trust HR when the very organization setting the standards can't seem to live up to them? Nestle's CEO. When most people think of corporate controversies, they think fraud, harassment, or toxic workplaces. And technically that's true. But sometimes all it takes is one statement to expose how a company really thinks. In 2005, the CEO of Nestle, Peter Brabeck-Lemata, made comments during a discussion about water that sparked global outrage. When asked whether access to water should be considered a human right, he suggested that treating water as a public right was extreme and instead framed it as a commodity, something that should have value or be managed like any other resource. Now, from a business perspective, you can probably understand that argument. But from a human perspective, it didn't land that way. The reaction was immediate. Critics accused Nestle of prioritizing profit over basic human needs. The comments we shared, debated, and reframed across media for years, fueling broader criticisms for the company's practices around water sourcing and bottled water operations. And this is where the HR and culture layer comes in, because leadership communication isn't just about what you say, it's about what your employees hear. When a CEO makes a statement like that, it doesn't just affect public perception, it impacts employee morale, trust, and alignment. Employees begin to ask, is this what we stand for? Is this what I represent by working here? And if the gap between personal values and company values becomes too wide, people disengage, and even some leave. From an HR perspective, this highlights a different kind of risk, not internal misconduct, but reputational culture risk driven by leadership messaging. Because culture isn't just built through policies and practices, we all know this. It's shaped by what leadership chooses to prioritize and how they decide to communicate that to the world. Nestle later clarified and walked back aspects of the statement, emphasizing support for access to clean water. But by that point, the narrative had already taken hold. And that's the thing about leadership moments like this. You don't always get a second chance at first impression. And that's a wrap, folks, on today's Deep Cut. Every story you just heard, documented, verified, and real. So this is what we do here. We go past the surface, past the headlines, past what they wanted you to know, and find what's actually there. If this video gave you something to think about, made you want to talk, or made you want to send it to somebody, hit that subscribe button, because we drop a new Deep Cut video every Sunday. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and let us know which story hit you the hardest. Which one are you still thinking about? Thanks for tuning in. This has been the Deep Cut Stories, where the truth runs deeper than the headlines. And remember, every story has a deeper cut. We'll see you next Sunday.